I don't care what anybody says, zombies belong in Resident Evil. As much as I really appreciate games like RE4, RE7, and even Village to a certain extent, nothing really hits home like the classic Resident Evil games that focus on zombies as the main enemy type. Perhaps one of the most interesting characteristics of zombies in Resident Evil games is the fact that any side character of the series can become a zombie with just a single bite or exposure to the virus in some way. Which brings me to today's topic as we take a look at some of the most interesting and iconic zombified characters. For the record, this list will focus on main and side characters that we meet in Resident Evil games that are changed into a zombie due to being exposed to a virus. Zombie being the key word here. That means we'll be avoiding any individuals infected with other viruses and parasites that turn them into monsters instead of the traditional zombie, like Pierce and Steve. And since we are focusing on main and side characters, any nameless zombie with a basic monster design will not be included on this list. So this eliminates zombies like the Keeper in Resident Evil and the Truck Driver in Resident Evil 2. But with that out of the way, my name is Ruben with Nerdspace Games, and this is my top 10 zombified characters of Resident Evil. Let's get it. Number 10, Zombie Edward. One thing that fans of Resident Evil were excited about when they first heard about a prequel to the original game was the fact that we would get more time with STAR's Bravo team prior to Alpha team arriving a day later. Sadly, outside of Rebecca Chambers, most of the team were barely in Resident Evil 0 outside of a few quick cameos. We did, however, get the opportunity to see one of Rebecca's squad mates meet their end in this prequel. Enter Edward Dewey. Ed was a character that was listed as an officer of STAR's Bravo team in the first game, but we never physically saw him in that game. Therefore, our first encounter with Ed was in RE0. After searching a nearby train for a bit, Rebecca finds a fatally injured Edward Dewey after he jumps through a window while escaping from zombie dogs. Unfortunately, he succumbs to his injuries and dies after warning Rebecca of the monsters in the forest. Later in the game, when Rebecca or Billy are making their way to the back of the train to activate the brakes, they'll come across a zombified version of Edward. While you'll come across him, no matter who you send to the back of the train, you'll be treated to a cutscene if you send Rebecca, as she'll recognize her fallen squad mate. Number 9, Zombie Elliot, Resident Evil 2 Remake. Compared to most games of the franchise, RE2 Remake features the most iconic and unique zombified characters of the series. Even some of the smaller characters of the game stand out as being unique compared to other zombified characters of the franchise. For example, take a look at Elliot, an officer of the RPD station. He's obviously a pretty forgettable character to the point that if you were a casual fan of this game, you might not have realized who I was referring to when I said his name. Well, Elliot is actually the first cop that Leon or Claire come across in the first run of the game. After seeing him begging for help on a computer monitor, the player tracks his location to the east side of the RPD station, in which Leon or Claire attempts to save him by pulling him through the shutter door. Unfortunately, his lower half gets devoured by zombies and he dies in our hands as we pull his upper half into the room. Well, later in the game, Leon or Claire will find themselves coming through this corridor again. When they do, they'll now find the upper half of Elliot attempting to grab them as he's become a zombie now. Number 8, Zombie Murphy, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Murphy Seeker was a UBCS agent alongside Carlos, Tyrell, Nikolai, and Mikhail. In the remake of RE3, there's really only one outcome for the guy thanks to the removal of the branching storylines. However, in the original, he's killed by 2 different people in 2 different scenarios. While the first situation closely resembles the remake in which Nikolai kills him before he changes into a zombie, the original game also features a situation in which Carlos is the first to find him. Instead of killing him before he changes into a zombie, we find Murphy begging Carlos to kill him. Carlos is unable to do so at first until Murphy changes into a zombie right before our eyes. At that point, just before Murphy reaches Carlos, Carlos opens fire and kills a zombified Murphy. Number 7, Zombie Daniel, Resident Evil 2 Remake. Another character in RE2 Remake that becomes a zombie after you watch them die is Daniel Cortini. Like with Elliot, the name might not hit you right away if you are a casual fan. However, Daniel is the cop that either Leon or Claire find at the gas station moments before he is attacked and killed by a zombie. He's also the main character of the Ghost Survivors DLC, No Way Out. What most people might miss though is the fact that Daniel actually becomes a zombie before Leon or Claire escape the gas station. After either killing or running away from the first zombie of the game, the player will need to find a key in order to leave the storage area. As soon as they leave the storage area, the player can then turn around and find a zombified Officer Cortini attacking the door and trying to get a bite out of Claire or Leon. Small details like this is exactly why I love Resident Evil 2 Remake, and to this day, it's one of the best video game remakes that I've ever played. Number 6. Zombie Liz, Resident Evil 6. There were actually 2 Resident Evil 6 characters that came to mind when making this list. The first was the President of the United States, Adam Benford. Despite being the president, this scene really didn't do anything for me, and it didn't feel as impactful as other characters on this list for various reasons. Instead, I decided to go with Liz, a young college girl that we found in the first chapter of the game. After the death of the president, Leon and Helena find themselves searching the building for survivors. Eventually, they'll come across a father who is desperately trying to locate his missing daughter. We eventually find his daughter Liz, but she is clearly infected. After entering an elevator with both Liz and her father, Liz dies in his hands. Then the power goes out. From there, all we hear is the sound of crunching. When the lights come back on, we find a zombified Liz feeding on her own father. She then turns her attention to Leon and Helena, in which the player must use the iconic mechanic of the game, button mashing, to push her off and finish her off. The whole sequence leading up to Liz's transformation was one of the most unnerving and terrifying moments of the game. In fact, it may have been the only scary part of Resident Evil 6. No offense to RE6 fans out there, of course. Number 5. Zombie Marvin, Resident Evil 2. And we finally come across one of the most iconic zombified characters of Resident Evil, Marvin Branagh. In both the remake and the original game, either Leon or Claire will come across Marvin, a cop at the RPD station. In both versions of the game, Marvin is unfortunately infected already by the time we come across him. However, he hasn't changed into a zombie yet. In the original game, he'll give the player a key card that'll give them access to other parts of the station. Then when the player finds him again, he'll change into a zombie and attack them. In the remake, Marvin is a much more likable character and helpful character. The first time we come across him, he rescues either Leon or Claire from meeting a similar fate to Elliot by crushing a shutter door down on a zombie head. From here, he'll continue to aid the player and give them advice on how they could escape the station safely. After entering the secret passage, defeating Birkin for the first time, and arriving back at the station, the player can then make their way over back to Marvin. Sadly, Marvin has finally died and become a zombie. At this point, he'll attack the player, and either Leon or Claire will need to put him down or leave him for the other character to deal with in their second run of the game. Number 4. Zombie Brad, Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 Remake. Brad Vickers is the pilot of STAR's Alpha Team and one of 5 survivors of the Spencer Mansion incident. Upon arriving back to Raccoon City, Brad assisted Jill with trying to find ways to bring down the people responsible without drawing too much attention to himself. Eventually though, Umbrella sent Nemesis after the remaining STAR survivors, and it ultimately led to Brad's death in both versions of Resident Evil 3. While his cause of death is different in both games, both lead to Brad becoming a zombie eventually. In the original game, Brad is killed by Nemesis. Surprisingly though, you don't actually see zombie Brad in this game. It's actually Resident Evil 2 where the zombified version of him appears, and he only appears if the player refuses to pick up any items on their way to the RPD station in Scenario A of the game. The remake of Resident Evil 3, however, changed that. Not only does Brad appear in RE3 Remake, but he's also unavoidable. After Brad sacrifices himself to hold back a horde of zombies while Jill escapes, we later find him following Marvin. Yeah, the same Marvin from Resident Evil 2 that we just talked about. Well, as it turns out, Marvin was actually bit by Brad, and that's how he got infected. After biting Marvin, Brad turns his attention to Carlos, and the player could either kill him or leave him alive, in which Brad will continue to stalk the player by running past windows and eventually attacking Carlos again by the armory of the RPD station. Number 3. Zombie Emma, Resident Evil 2 Remake. The last entry from Resident Evil 2 focuses on a character that we actually don't have any gameplay with. In fact, calling her a zombified character is kind of misleading since she hasn't fully transitioned yet. Still, I just couldn't resist putting Emma Kendo on this list. Firstly, her look in Resident Evil 2 is truly terrifying. And when you think about the entire series as a whole, we don't really get to see zombie kids. While we don't get the full transformation, we get enough to make a massive impact in one of the saddest and most tragic scenes of the Resident Evil franchise. No lie, I'm still getting emotional just thinking about this scene right now. That's how impactful it was to see Emma's transition into a zombie. Her voice, her look, God, it was heartbreaking. Enough said.
She was a sweet little angel.
Mommy.
I was sleeping, honey. Okay? And I'm gonna put you to bed too, okay? Emma. Just go. Just give us some privacy.
Number 2, Zombie Forrest, Resident Evil 2002 Remake. Forrest is a Stars Bravo officer that the player finds on the balcony of the Spencer Mansion in both the original game and its remake. In both games, it appears that he was killed by zombie crows. However, for this list, we're focusing on the remake. That's because Forrest is a force to be reckoned with in the remake. In the 2002 version of Resident Evil, after beating the entire game, which includes both scenarios on normal difficulty or higher, players will unlock a new enemy that will appear in the game if they were to replay it. This enemy is known as One Dangerous Zombie. On closer examination, it turns out that this unique zombie is actually Forrest. If you watch a recent video of mine, then you would know that Forrest wears a vest that is carrying grenades on him. If the player were to damage Forrest in any way, he would explode and the player would get a game over instantly. Forrest will appear in 6 different locations throughout the Spencer Mansion, and each time, the player will have to avoid him instead of trying to kill him. For this reason, Forrest has become one of the most iconic and dangerous zombies in the Resident Evil franchise, which is exactly why we find him at number 2 on this list. Number 1, your teammates, Resident Evil Outbreak Files. So technically, the number 1 spot goes to multiple different characters. And while these zombified characters may not be as iconic as Brad or Marvin, or as dangerous as Forrest, or even as tragic as Emma, the fact that each of the main characters on your team in Resident Evil Outbreak can become zombies is fucking awesome and hilarious at the same time. And I absolutely love it. Anyway, Outbreak Files 1 and 2 are spin-off Resident Evil games on the PlayStation 2. It was an online 3-player co-op experience, which was far before its time, as online gaming was nowhere near the level it is today. The idea was that 3 players could team up to complete different scenarios, each set in a different location within Raccoon City. Another unique feature of this game though was the infection rate. Unlike most Resident Evil games, not only do the players have to be concerned about their health, but they also have to be concerned about the infection rate reaching 100%. If it were to reach 100%, then the player would die. Here's where things get more interesting though. If you're playing online with other players and they die or their infection rate reaches 100%, they'll become a zombie. It's only for a short amount of time, but as a zombie, these players could either attempt to feed on their own allies that are still human or just become a zombie pet that follows their living allies around the map. It was a new mechanic that was kind of fun to experience, and it's something that is definitely worth the number 1 spot on today's list. But that does it for this episode of Nerd Space Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Are the main characters of Resident Evil Outbreak the most iconic and interesting zombified characters, or do you think someone else deserves that title? Let me know down below. Also, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more survival horror content. And don't forget to leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. Anyway, thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerd Space Games. Take care.